Duncan Shields, alias Thorin, is the Esports Historian, an award-winning journalist and veteran analyst with some of his most influential work coming out of the Counter-Strike and League of Legends scenes. Thorin, welcome to the No Frauds Club. Today I wanted to start things off by just talking about the scenes that I just mentioned, League of Legends and Counter-Strike. These are obviously where a lot of the people who follow your work know you from. And specifically in League of Legends, I wanted to ask just a almost very open-ended question. The most like your favorite or most enjoyable seasons of League to watch, and maybe some of the characteristics that spoke to you there. So if you think back you've obviously been following it for a long time, so I wanted to get your read on what you thought was like the best out of some of the top seasons for you.
Sure. I mean, obviously, I'm going to do this in the context that, to be fair, if you ever do go back and watch old games from enough years ago, I would say usually the time frame seems to be like 3 or 4 year cut off. After about 3 or 4 years, even if at the time it was the most amazing play ever, it does look a lot worse if you go back and look now. So obviously, I'm doing this relative to the eras that they were in. Like it's going to look a lot cleaner if you watch even like lower level play in the modern day. But I would say, as a result, I say all that to essentially sort of preempt the fact that I'm probably going to shock people by saying I actually think the most enjoyable season to watch was season 2. Because if people don't know, season 1, it hadn't really gotten fully going as an esport. Like, it was still like a lot of online play, for example. If you know, like, the Worlds was like, I mean, there was barely any countries in the world in that scenario, hence famously why there was no Korea, there was no China, etc. So season 1 doesn't really matter, but season 2 was where the game was getting like just good enough that if you watched a game now, at least some elements, you would definitely recognize what's going on. It would be a little bit unusual, but you'd understand the basics of like that people are skilled and who's good. Season 2 had the sweet spot that, on the one hand, they didn't really seem like they'd adjusted the meta at all related to esports, because at the time it was just a video game, you know. So I actually think in a weird way it benefited from not yet sort of being hit by all the sort of weird assumptions and concepts of how game devs balance their games and what they're trying to accomplish with each season and all that. I hadn't really gotten into the weeds of that. And more importantly, it was the last season where it had a true open circuit, if people don't know. So this was where all Riot did, essentially, is host Worlds for season 2 and then regionals. And actually, at the time, I remember thinking, I mean, sadly, we always knew they were going to go beyond this, but I remember thinking that's actually the perfect amount of involvement you want from a game dev in your game. You want them to maybe, look, it's their game, so if they want to run the World Championship, fair enough, but then, like, you know, just put up some prize money, do a tournament that's separate to everyone else, run some qualifiers so it's legit, but then let everyone else, like the ESLs of the world, DreamHacks, MLG, IPL, there's a lot of companies back then, you have to remember, let these DreamHacks, let these companies run their tournaments, so that if they're good tournaments, you get to enjoy all the varieties of the esports circuit, whereas obviously, if you didn't watch season 2, every other season is very much more alike than any of them were to season 2. Like, once you become the Riot internalized ecosystem, it very much is just like a sort of simpler version of what we have now. You have your regional splits, and then you have 1 or 2 international competitions, and then maybe if you were lucky, you got an odd IEM peppered in there. So I think also, actually, if I'm going to pick other seasons, I should probably pick some that have like those IEMs and stuff. Like, I actually thought when they had IEM Katowice, for example, for CS, for League of Legends rather, even though they were never allowed to have as many teams as the main Riot tournaments, it's a way that Riot sort of kept it as not as a good, it couldn't ever compete with Riot's brand, basically. They still would let you have a couple of good teams from each of the big regions. So I thought some of the Katowices were pretty good. So I think off the top of my head, I think as much as other people might hate it, I actually think I quite enjoyed season 5. I think was pretty good. And that was one where you could still play like you could kind of play carry tops finally. I was always a big fan of that. You had, I thought, generally a pretty good meta, because on the one hand, you could like those champions in the game where you could express skill decently. People like Uzi was still amazing, but on the other hand, you had like all the amazing Korean style of sort of control play where, if people don't know, I was never against that. If people don't know, I was against the idea it was the only way you could play the game. I thought that made it a little bit reductive and a bit boring, and it's the reason why like Europeans weren't as good as a result. But if you know like how I like CSGO, like I've always loved teams like Astralis and the existence teams and the tactical teams. So I also did have a lot of appreciation for those like amazing SKT teams that could be like, you know, 4K goal behind in any game, but still always team fight back at 20 minutes and find the right dragon pick or whatever. You know, like I thought there was a genius to how those teams played. So season 5 was pretty cool. Season 2, season 5. Let me think what else. Because the thing is, in general, I've never been a big fan of any season where they overtuned the game. So a lot of people liked season 3, for example, but I actually thought the Assassins went too far there, and it just basically made, if you were like a mage player, you were just kind of a bit redundant, you know, or just couldn't be as impactful. Similarly, I wasn't a big fan of like season 6 and season 7. I think they got a bit lost with some of the newer champions and some of the items. Like, for example, I thought that Ardent Sentiment was fucking garbage. I thought it was ruined the game. Season 8's a weird example because if people remember, it's where they sort of opened the game up, and especially like one of my favorite roles, top lane, became like, again, a true role. We can play everything. You can be the best player in the world in that role. You can fight all over the map. It was no longer about this Korean style. Obviously, they've got the trackers now. The problem with that one is I thought it was a very good season, but I actually thought that started to drift too far away from the idea of any tactical play. It's almost like you went cold turkey on the idea of doing the vision control style. You went too far the other way to essentially just embrace the LPL fighting style. So I also think, actually, fair enough, in the modern day, I think season 9 was a banger. Not just because of the obvious reason Westerners will have, which is their bias because G2 was really good. But I actually think the reason G2 was good is because of what you could do in the game at the time. Like, that was probably one of the golden eras, if people remember, where it wasn't that it was the old method where you took the Baron and you just like pushed the inhibs to win the game. It wasn't like the new one where you have to do the dragon fight. It was like, it was just enough of a sweet spot that as you saw, if you watched G2 that year, they could they were the masters of the mid game and they could just paint an amazing canvas every game, even though no one, including them, really knew what they were going to do each time. So I think the interesting thing about League is each season is quite distinct. Fair enough to them, actually. As much as we rage about them, you can remember them fairly distinctly as a result. And I do think if you look at the history of the game, it's not as simple as like, oh, you know, I liked season 2, so everything that was in the Riot ecosystem sucked. Now, there was some good seasons later on. I even think I would say, like last year, for example, right before, unfortunately, they hit the end of the season almost, like the summer playoffs and Worlds, it was actually in a really good meta again last year in the summer. Like, we had you could have a lot of like varieties to how you played. You could play through all different lanes. So again, if you notice, my general bias, this is why Counter-Strike's one of my favorite games, is I like the game to be fairly open-ended, and then the dev can tweak things. Like if things are too overpowered, like obviously example in CSGO, like the Org or the Krieg, where they become the only thing that's you. Yeah, then I want the game dev to step in. But aside from that, you know, just kind of create a buffet, as it were, and then let us pick what we want from it. That's when I usually enjoy the game the most.
Right. There was an example of an older interview you did where towards the end you mentioned that one of the things that you find the most compelling about games is when there are a lot, like a wide breadth of angles of approach, a lot of tools, and maybe some of them are in a vacuum overpowered, but they can be attenuated by just somebody using another tool that's also equally powerful, yes, but in a different application. I've heard, and I'm not a Dota guy, but I've heard that Dota 2 is kind of balanced with this in mind, or at least that's what they resulted in organically, perhaps, is that a lot of the picks there, a lot of the item builds resulted in this very, you would say, perhaps overtuned, again, in a vacuum, but the fact that so many different options existed, it allowed a lot of different ways of skill expression, right? And that's something that, yes, I think was definitely missing from towards the later end when I fell out of love with League, you could say. So I can agree with that. The other thing I wanted to ask is a bit of a follow-up to CSGO. Is there actually a meta or like maybe it's more defined by the teams in CS, I think is like a fair thing to say, because of the fact that the changes from the devs are much more infrequent. Was there a year or a season of League, I mean, of Counter-Strike that you find the most compelling looking back on? Or is it this one right now that we're entering into? What's your take overall?
What's beautiful about Counter-Strike, at least until we had this online period where we couldn't hold the lands and all this jazz, which I do think, unfortunately, not only is it now, this is the part that I don't think people have really took stock of, is think how many years it's been now. Like, dude, we're getting to the point now where it's going to be like a 4th or 5th of CSGO soon. Like, this is going to be a lot. It's not just the sort of like half a year we all initially kind of in our brains just put aside, put an asterisk next to that. It doesn't count. It's one of the reasons, by the way, why I think I was one of the only people, despite being a notorious hater of online play, who doesn't really think online play is legit, I was like one of the only people who was in the end having to debate as to why like people like Axile and Zewu being really good online does count. Like, we can't just ignore all that, because spoiler, if we do that, like, there's essentially we have like 5 lands for 3 years or something. Like, it's not going to work, is it, boys? So the problem is, in our game in CSGO, we need sample size. That's what we love to use to see how good people are, to see who's actually legit. And so I would say this: the great thing about CSGO is when I just did, like, I bemoaned the fact that season 2 in League was amazing, but then, you know, the others were like good, but in a more limited way. It's like CSGO is like if you had season 2, but the whole time. So there might be times when, as you say, like, I had a predilection towards a certain style of play, or maybe a gun was stronger, or as you, the obvious examples of the teams, the rosters make it more fun. But I actually think the good thing about the game in general is there are very few periods, I think, in CSGO where the game itself actually was bad. Like, you could actually even argue, I mean, it's weird because this just shows actually how, if anything, maybe CS is supposed to go the Dota route. Because I do actually think the period before they buffed the M4A1S, basically it's the same exact economy we have now. It's just that because you made the CT good and stronger, it's like we're sort of like camouflaging what the real problem is. I thought that era where the T side economy was mad OP, and if you ever lost the T pistol but then you won the follow-up, you just broke the CTs completely for the like. I thought that was pretty bad. I thought it was producing some pretty bad games. Plus it did also coincide with the online play, so I think it's an easy one to say that's probably the worst period. I think the best, if I had to pick all factors combined, that the game was in a good place in terms of development, the meta was quite good, loads of really good teams. The classic for me is always 2015, I think, because that was the year of people don't know, when we hadn't gotten yet to like the $1 million majors. So to be fair, the money wasn't as pumped up in the scene. But as a result, like if you go and look at the top 10 back then, it's a really strong top 10. Like you look, the top 4 or 5 teams, depending on what time period we're talking about, can all win the tournament. We were talking like TSM, with now Astralis, like Virtus Pro, obviously the great Polish players, obviously Fnatic, NIP maybe, depends on the French players. Then on, you have those crazy dark horses like the Na'Vi teams with Guardian. You have whatever team Kenny S is in, if he's not in Envious, if he was in the Titan at this point in time. You have MSLs like Dignitas teams. Like, people to forget these top 10s were fire. And as I say, it's like the circuit had gotten big enough that we had like what would appear like a circuit now. Like you have really big 250k tournaments. It was also the year where they went from being not just majors to like there's like 3 or 4 extra prestige events, as it were. I think they probably would have called them back then. So yeah, I think that was probably the sweet spot. But luckily, as I say, CSGO, the game itself holds up so much that almost any era that has like a team that's dominant or something special happen, like Astralis come along, you can enjoy those just as much, even if they're not your favorite year, I think.
And speaking of that era in general, I know you're a fan of narratives, especially if they're wildly inaccurate and just propagated by fans online. So I wanted to ask you about what your thoughts are on the op nerf that happened around that time, because people have just, it's now common fact, at least on the subreddit for CSGO, that the reason why for the op nerf was Kenny S, and not because, maybe Valve just got owned, some devs got owned in matchmaking or something, which, I mean, I don't have evidence to either one of those things, but I'm curious if you could clear that up. Is that actually legit, or do you think that there was more to that? Not necessarily the motivation, but also whether or not Kenny S himself was even massively affected or disproportionately affected by that op nerf, because it feels like he was still relevant for at least a brief period afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, he was. Like, technically, he was even the MVP of the major that was, I think, like 5-6 months afterwards. So, yeah, he was still a very good player. It's just, I did literally, like, he went, essentially, if you're only a modern day fan, he basically was what Simple is now. Like, every single game, whether it was an online game, an offline game, a game against a team that's better, a game against a team that's worse, you just actually assumed he was going to be the best player in the server and or drop, like, mind-blowing numbers. And as I say, he would do it in every game. Now, true, Simple's done it, like, years and years at this point in time. But at the time, we had never had anyone done this. Like, before that, the idea was like, yes, if you're get right and you're the best player on the best team in the best form at the tournament and your team plays out, then yes, then you drop the like mind-blowing numbers. That's just logical, isn't it? But like, this is a guy where, like I say, it's like Simple. It's like it didn't matter what his teammates were doing. He was just carried every game. So the problem is, though, this is where the bad news is. All my interactions with Valve devs and all the stories I've heard from my friends in the industry, including pro players, actually imply that they, at least, I don't know up until a couple of years ago, but I don't know, since a couple of years ago, rather. But at this era we're talking about, the 2015, as far as I know, they didn't follow the esports side, or they barely knew what was going on. So I would be very shocked if Kenny S or JW was the other obvious one back then. I would be very shocked if it's watching like Kenny S or JW or fucking Smiths. I don't think they're watching these players, unfortunately, and going like, wow, this needs to be brought. In fact, if anything, that's where, in my opinion, fans don't seem to get it. That I think the actual casual matchmaking fan is closer to the worldview of the game dev than anyone on Reddit or in the esports community or people like me and you in the industry. Because my vibe actually is when they sort of complain. I remember one of the reasons Valve gave was something along the lines of like, it's being used as a fucking, mobile shotgun or whatever the line was. Like, it's the idea of combat AWPing, basically. Like, first of all, by the way, spoiler, people still don't even do that much now. It's still mega risky. But secondly, I genuinely don't think they were talking about pro player. That's why everyone thought they meant Kenny S, because he basically at the time, also kind of like Simple, could just hit like no scopes that no one else even went for. Like, it didn't even make sense you would hit these. So like, I know to fans, they think that must be it. Like, he was the best player. He was dominating everyone. He used the AWP every time. They even, by the way, he was so good that this is the classic example, that on the old version of Nuke, not the rework, on the old version of Nuke, I have seen rounds where Titan dropped Kenny S a glass cannon T-side AWP, where he had no armor and just got an AWP, and no one else on the like they had one player just had like too much money. They were, because that was like a winning player. That's how good this guy. On a fucking Nuke, by the way. Back then, AWP was supposed to complain about and go like, you can't even do anything unless you play ramp room or whatever the fucking line was, So yeah, basically he was like super good, but unfortunately, I don't think Valve really wasn't like fucking Red Phone that offered their offers like, oh, he's getting too good at the game. I think sadly when they say It's being used as I think for real, no joke, that's them going and playing matchmaking and stuff. And that's what they think their experience is. Because that's why I don't think people get it. I don't need it's not that I'm doing like the Reddit fan of like, you don't even know what you're talking about. It's not that the dev has to be like at the level of a pro. But I would like them to like be grounded in like what the pro scene is and kind of see, you know, the back and forth. Because to me, the pro essentially shows you the limits of what can be done with the gun. So in the same sense as why if it really had to been Kenny S or JW that got the gun nerfed, well, it'd be silly then, wouldn't it? Because the joke is like they were like the only two people who could even do that shit. Like, spoiler, Guardian didn't go for the fucking no scopes JW, does he? It's just like a really good normal AWP in that sense, you know? So to me, I think it would be silly on either end to use that. Like, you can't use matchmaking to balance the game that pros play, but you also can't use the absolute best pros. Because let's be real, if that was true, you'd have to nerf now based on what Simple does, right? Even though, again, I would just go the other way. I would spin it this way and go, yeah, but who can do what Simple's doing with the AWP? Like, almost no one. There's about 2 people in the world, right? So I think that whole topic, unfortunately, is like super confusing. It definitely doesn't help. You'll notice that we don't really have any resources where Valve ever addresses these things. Like, there's not sort of like a Q&A thing where someone can ask them. Like, I wouldn't even know where to start to try and ask someone to do an interview with me about that topic.
I wanted to go a little bit deeper on the idea that you said you obviously have these two different ideas. I'll balance for the pro scene or I'll balance for the more casual play. And I feel like it's a false dichotomy we've been served up by developers, by maybe just average fans who are looking for a reason why there might be this strange behavior going on by the developers. But regardless of how you do it, you are already, in my mind, playing a completely different game. Even professional players themselves, when they join up FPL, are playing a completely different game. And that's with other top pros than compared to when they're on their own team. And so it feels, I think, very... there's some sort of duplicity going on. It feels wrong and completely inaccurate and misleading to say that, well, we have to have the experience of the layman who's just playing casually a couple games a week to be at least, you know, the framework has to be identical to that of the pros. Because even though, yes, in a technical sense, the rules are the same, although I guess they're not always, you know, in Counter-Strike, there's examples of like overtime is obviously something that's not present in matchmaking or whatever. But by and large, yeah, the rules are the same. But the actual way that you go about it, you know, interfacing with the title is completely different under those contexts. So could you give us some thoughts on the sort of logic or lack thereof, perhaps, that developers historically have said, or that you've read from your interactions with developers about this very thing, about balancing for both and trying to hold them on? Because the example we haven't given yet is Riot. And, you know, Riot does pay attention to the pro scene. I remember maybe season 6 or 7, they had a line where they had adjusted the spawn timers or the respawn death timer scaling or whatever. And in it, they actually had a quote that was basically, you know, we've reduced this so that when you find yourself completely team wiped by a Korean academy team, you won't lose the game. And that was a reference to TSM losing in some international tournament with, I can't remember the team, unfortunately, but there's a Korean team that I don't even think they made it to LCK the next year. But so this is obviously
it's probably one of those like Kesper Cups in the off season or something, I assume, right?
Okay. Yeah. And so because TSM died, or they lost because of a team fight, and then they lost the game because of that, after being up pretty heavily, you know, that's obviously like, at least that, you know, that they're watching it, even if that wasn't really the reason why they changed it, but they obviously alluded to it. So Riot obviously follows their pro scenes pretty heavily. But even still, they have this sort of push and pull where they're trying to balance for either one. So could you give us some thoughts on this sort of balancing framework and what your opinions of it are?
Like, that's also an area where, if you notice, most of my discussions and what I try to do in the industry is like, I know in the modern world, these terms are all cursed as fuck because they've just been used by people in media, the most cursed industry of all time. So when they say things like thought leader, that means some like sinister fucking like Orwellian, like, I am part of the globalists who will now convince you to do what I like. I'm not doing that, obviously, but I mean in the sense, like, I do like the idea that if I don't think people have thought about a certain thing, I like to be the guy who pushes the food for thought out there, or sort of prods a little bit. It's why sometimes I am incredibly antagonistic in how I phrase things. I want people to actually engage with it. I don't want them to just passively go, I just disagree. It's like, no, then actually let's get into it. So one thing I've always disagreed with as an assumption that's pre-baked in is the one that essentially you're addressing, which every game dev believes, which goes like this: whatever they see on their screen when they're watching the World Championship has to be the same in theory, as you say, like the way you play the game won't be, you know, but what appears on the screen should be the same as if right after the final ends, you boot into the game and you're playing like a ranked game. The logic goes that somehow that is like, it's almost like they think there's like an integrity and that has to be maintained between that, and that the dream is that it's perfectly one-to-one exactly. I think even their dream, which is an absolute pipe dream, could never exist, would be the notion that even the playing experience was the same, that, you know, somehow when you boot into League, like, even though you're playing with like I'm in the the Netherlands and I'm playing with a guy from Germany who's my juggler, somehow that would look anything like SKT playing and Bengi and like, I know that's probably their even like more crazy dream, but obviously that was never functionally ever going to happen. But the problem is I don't even agree with that as a premise, because what I don't get about it is it doesn't make any sense in any other competitive endeavor I've ever seen. Like, I'll give you an example. I know loads of people who are into chess, but like their favorite version of chess, for example, to watch is like speed chess, because they don't want to be there for like 10 hours, but maybe to play they like just normal chess, or maybe they even do chess by fucking email or something, you know. So the difference between what they play and what they watch is very different, because remember, what you choose for entertainment is different from what you like to engage with yourself. So I find it very well. I think of all the other sports, like European soccer is an obvious one. Who the fuck is playing 11 aside on grass with football boots with studs on, not trainers? Like, who's playing that every week? And yet everyone in fucking Europe's a fan of soccer. Everyone. And like, it's ridiculous. And remember, when you go and play soccer in Europe, right, best case scenario would be that you played like amateur on the 11-a-side pitch, right? The very few people are doing that who are adult, right? Obviously, you might do it if you're a school kid or something. Beyond that, the modern day person, if they play at all, remember, loads of people who follow football and soccer don't play at all. If they play, they're going to be playing like the classic way in the UK is you play 5-a-side indoor on an indoor court with a totally different type of ball and like half-size nets. So that's nothing like the experience of like a Premier League game. If you were expecting that some of the integrity, there'd be almost none. Like, you can do all sorts of things you can't do there. They can do stuff you can't do. Similarly, beyond that, like, kids are just playing like, they're not even playing teams, they're playing like 8 kids just kicking a ball and maybe one guy's in goal or something mad. So what's mad is nothing else in any other hobby area suggests to me there has to be a 1-to-1 ratio in that respect. So I've never personally got it. I've always thought logically there should be some sort of a tiered system, and sadly every time I've brought this up in the game, I don't think they even got what I was trying to tell them, never mind like sort of disagreed. Basically what I think should happen is this: either you make it like most games now, so in League of Legends for example, there are in theory 2 modes, right? There's ranked and then there's normals. The problem is no fucker ever clicks normals unless they're trying to like duo with an e-girl or something. Like, that's about the only time any human being or their cousin isn't the right rank to play with them. You know, that's about it, right? So even though normals should just be where you go if you want like a no pressure game with no stress and nobody typing to you and you can play whatever you want, you can be a moron, you can be good, you can be right, that should be the offshoot. That should take care of all our problems. But instead what happens is everyone who plays ranked is the noob moron playing with his friends, not trying to play. So the problem is already, in my opinion, like the lowest level's nothing like pro play, even if you make the game look like that. So I would make the lowest level of League, no joke, like the simplest version of the game. I wouldn't even have all the champions there if it was me personally. I'd have I'd maybe start you with basic champions or something. And I would make it so that the idea is it's not just the rank show you how skilled you are, but listen, I'd make 2 modes. I'd have a normal mode that's just you have it however you want. You can custom settings or something. I'd have a ranked mode. And the idea was as you go up and up and up, you just get access to like more skills in the game. Like you have harder champions. You maybe now there's like an extra mechanic you can do so that once you get to like the challenger level, you do like all in crazy, insane players that would be too OP for the guy at silver. It would ruin all his champions, you know, hence the famous, like if you don't know, the most famous example ever in League probably is the champion Rise, because basically when Rise has like a fucking 40% win rate in like normal play, that usually means it's like broken as fucking pro play, because the joke is normal people in solo queue don't know what they're doing, but then like the best player in the world is just going to shit all over you because of how good the champion kit is. But it's like you have to know what you're doing. So I would essentially take that principle and I would mirror it with as you go through the ranks, because I think it'd be the other way around. Like, as I say, there'd be a normals mode where you could play this hard mode if you want for no reason with a bunch of dickhead friends. You could do that. But in my opinion, it would actually be like sports. It's like if you actually wanted to play 11-side soccer, essentially what you want to do is get on the path to pro. You want to be on some level playing competitively. So you would put in the effort to go and do it. You'd go and join a local club. So in the same way, you'd get good essentially if you wanted to play the top version of the game. And spoiler, I'm purposely, setting up the condition here. You wouldn't want to have all those champions in the game if you were really low ranked. Like, there's a reason why all the new champions in League of Legends famously just ruin the game when they come out the first month. Because not only does no one know what they're doing, but if you're at a low level, you're all bad anyway, so you would have no clue how to play against it. So, like, in my opinion, there's like a system that if anyone ever cracked it, this is like $1 billion idea, if they could implement. I'm not saying I know how to execute, I'm sticking more to the idea here, but I think there's something to the idea. Because in my opinion, if we don't do this approach, there is only one approach that is being co-signed by all the good devs, and it's the opposite one. It is the game will just get more and more and more and more watered down, because what happens is the things that get the guy through the door to play his first ever game will be the things that will spoil the pro scene. Because what they're trying to do essentially, this is why the games like Fortnite and Minecraft, they come up but they don't have an esports value, because the problem is you had to reduce the lowest common denominator entry point to be so low that yes, literally a 9-year-old kid at your school is now playing the game. Well, the problem with that is like I can't have CSGO balanced based on how a 9-year-old child entering the game for the first time would experience the game. I can't, he doesn't have to, if the game has to be appealing to him, we're not going to be able to have simple doing all this amazing stuff. We're not going to be able to have tactics with all the unique utility. We're going to melt our game down to basically like some very simple sort of shape that goes in a whole almost level meme fucking template, aren't we?
And that's the other thing too, is that I feel like on the flip side, you touched on League of Legends having new champions, which completely morph everything about the game and how it's played both at a pro level and at a low level. But I think you're right in saying that it's especially at a low level where everything is either busted or super low win rate because people aren't equipped with the mechanics or the understanding to do it well. I wanted to talk a little bit about maybe pro players in either one of these games, but I imagine you'll find more examples for League, where because of a meta change, form drop off occurred and you can almost like instantly trace it back, or the other way where they actually got really good, surprisingly. So, I mean, you could always point to like the AUG meta in CSGO as like, well, that coincided in some ways with ENCE's, explosive form back at I think it was a Katowice 2019 off the top of my head. It might've been.
Sure.
And so that's like one example where like, okay, well, here's a meta change, and suddenly this team we've never really been talking about is, it's not the only thing that happened, but it's obviously a key factor. So anything come to mind for that? Because I mean, and this is maybe a more broad topic as well that you might be able to have some insight on is, in CSGO, they had a while ago, Valve instituted this randomizer for maps as part of the veto that would randomly select the last map. And it included 2 maps that had just never been played at one point, and were basically brand new. And so obviously the level of play and a competitive level is not going to be high in those circumstances. It would almost be like if you randomly had a League of Legends player at the pro level select a champion that might not be fit for the role. He might not have practiced. It just came out. It's almost like that in a way. And so I kind of want to dig deeper on that because people have this thing in their mind where they're watching and they think, oh, competitive integrity. That means, rules are being followed and, pros there's no conflicts of interest. And although most of the fans don't really know what that is either, but, they have this conception of what competitive integrity is. I don't think many people think about it in the context of game balance, where you always make sure that there's like a fair and even playing field, but from the game and the tournament format and all these other things. So any thoughts on either the careers of pros being, reduced or improved as a result of this meta, maybe artificially we could say, and also about how this affects the overall landscape of a fair battleground for pros to do battle with?
I mean, in League, because the game is so radically changed in terms of the patches and in terms of the frequency of the patches, even like the thing that makes League really extreme is it's not just that they make a patch and then people figure out what's OP. It's that by the time people sort of just figure out what's OP, the patch changes again, so you don't ever have a real chance for sort of the second, third and fourth order meta adaptations. So whereas in something like StarCraft, if something OP came along initially, sometimes like famously in StarCraft 2 for example, they would often be like a bit late to patch, like they'd be like 6 months late. Well, sometimes within that 6 months, sometimes it wasn't even a problem, the original thing that was OP. Actually, someone in the meantime had found an OP counter to that now everyone used, and suddenly that race in whatever race matchup now loses that matchup. You never know when the game sort of like fixes itself because you give people time to sort of really explore it. So in League, it's a bit more hard to do like specifics, as in like I could do a million of them, but I'll give you a couple of classic ones. Like I always thought an obvious example was the jungle role, because it's probably the position that's been the most fucked with by the game dev. Almost every single year, they either like reinvent or just tweak the role, and so basically it's one of the only roles I'm aware of in esports where a lot of the sort of specific like little details you might have learned in techniques don't always cross over the years, and so it's one of the reasons why there's a lot of turnover in that role. Unfortunately, you can't be as much of like a genius and just hold on by using pure experience that you can in roles like, I don't know, ADC or top lane or something, if you're really a master of those roles. So I would say a classic example would be a player who still plays to this day. He plays for Gen G, a player called Peanut from Korea, because basically he was like your prototypical like Lee Sin player. He's like the pop off gank jungler, just use mechanics to dominate the game, get a couple of kills early, snowball the game, and if he has a game, he's going to win the MVP of that game because he's going to look fucking amazing. But the problem this guy had was he wasn't sort of the classic sort of tank brain jungler who just does pathing and then sort of like safely comes to the lane. So basically, when famously they used to switch what you had to have on the jungle item, one of the meta often would switch at some point during the year to go from being able to play those carries in the ganking jungle junglers to the Cinder Hulk junglers, which was a type of tank jungler essentially. And this was when now top lane could play a carry because the tank was in the jungle instead. And basically, this just took away all this guy's strengths. Like, it wasn't now about mechanics. You weren't making crazy like outplayers with all champions with dashes. Now essentially you were asked to like be a tank, like peel, only ever go when it's correct. Like essentially it was a totally different skill set. And this guy, no joke, would go from like best jungler in the world or contender to like literally can't even win a series against like, you know, the guy who's like the 5th best in his region. Like the drop off could be huge. I would say actually there's a CSGO example I could give you, which is in CSGO. There's 2 that I think are really extreme. One is, I even included it myself because everyone forgets it, is that the player that for me, if anything, showed something was OP in the game. Because notice I said you don't go with the simples, the Kenny S of the world. It wasn't the AWP, it was actually the CZ. Now the CZ, in my opinion, was OP when you saw the player Smiths play with it. Because even though in Source in the beginning of CSGO, Smith was actually a pretty good player. He had some skills, you know. This was the period in time, we're talking like late 2014, early 2015, where he was starting to just become like just like essentially the worst player on his team, but not a liability yet, but just the worst player on his team. And no joke, because he was a guy who famously would like secondary AWP or use it when he was hot. When the CZ was really good, he either would like, because it was the pre-AWP nerf, he either would hit you with the AWP shot or you would rush him, and because the CZ was so good, he would kill you every time as well. And when that started happening, that was when, like, for the CZ, I was like, right, this is a good example where gun's OP, because it's taken what should essentially be like, you know, the 10th best AWPer, and it's making him like capable of looking like he's the 3rd best AWPer or like one of the better players on his team just because of what you've done to the gun. So there's like an example. I would also say if you want a team-wide example, I never got credit for this because sadly what people do in esports is this, mate. They dunk on me one day after the prediction by going, this didn't age well, but then the joke is when their comment doesn't age well, no one comes back and goes, oh, by the way, Thorin, I was wrong. Actually, you know, 6 months ago, like, you were right on that, so I never get my fucking flowers, mate. Even though you can go check this tweet out, the timing is fucking unreal, mate. When we first went online, you might remember that one of the really good LAN teams that started to fall off was Mouse Sports, obviously with Carrigan, Rops, Frozen, and this team, if you remember, had been consistently one of the best teams on LAN, but online, they, just like Fnatic, very quickly after the first couple of events, just dropped off a cliff, and they were like almost never winning any games, it felt like. They became really bad. And when they first fell off, I told people, because they just nerfed the Krieg around this time, I said, that's the team that'll get hit by this Krieg nerf. Like, it'll get wrecked. Because if you ever looked it up, essentially, the good players abused the fuck out of it, like you'd imagine, like Rops and Frozen, etc. But even the bad players like Carrigan and Christian, skill-wise we're talking here, you could see it sort of like elevated their stats, because the idea was you didn't have to be as precise. Like, everyone knows this is famously the reason why Nico's game didn't look as good, because he was like some fucking samurai who refused to use the gun when it was invented. So even though he was like the absolute best like swordsman, actually just doing a perfect Ferrari peek and 2-bulleting a guy with an AK wasn't as good actually as like a half a skilled player just sort of spraying you with the Krieg. Like, somehow it like evened it up, didn't it? So I remember watching their whole team and thinking, like, look, back then at least, this team wasn't as good as it looks on paper now. Remember, Frozen was like 17 years old. Rops is only just coming into his own as a star. Chris J's still there, who's not even a relevant player now. Fucking Carrigan himself, obviously, he's not a big fragger. Like, you look at that Woxic, if you remember, was a very like streaky player. He either like dominated or he just fucking feed. So if you look at that team had no business being like number 3 in the world or whatever the fuck. So look, part of it's Carrigan and the genius things he did, but also part of it is they had a gun that just sort of helped you on T side. It essentially just sort of like helped you get over the line where it might have been like touch and go if you got those kills. So even though people don't think of CSGO as a game where things affect it, like the Ents one, for example, like I agree, it definitely helped them get better, but there's also plenty of other teams in their era definitely farmed that gun too. I think that's actually an example where you just track the timeline. Mate, that team never got anywhere close to being a top team again once that Krieg got nerfed. It was just done after that. It was over.
Right. Would you say that these giant switches for individual teams are evidence of this, the competitive integrity being not as all it's chalked up to be? Or I suppose more egregious examples of that would be the randomizer that I spoke of, or the fact that back, you know, if you go back a couple of years.
Oh, I should probably touch on that actually. Yeah. By the way, the most extreme one ever probably is the randomizer and the new maps that you're talking about from ESL1 Clone 2014. So if people don't know, it's not an exaggeration. Even though NIP was in 5 major finals, they were even in major finals after this, by the way, they were in 5 major finals total, and this was the one they won. And the joke is, this is the one where they were the worst team of any of them that they were ever in. In every other final, they were a bigger favourite, they should have won, or, you know, like, there's a matter of fact, this is the one they shouldn't have won. And literally, if people don't know, the map Cobblestone, first of all, isn't the version you've played. It was the old version with a broken wall on the B site. And it was essentially a super CT-sided map. Like, it was incredibly difficult for the T's to do anything on this map. And basically, this map had never been played except at the major. And not only was it at the major, but because we had this randomizer you're talking about, unless you essentially, on the best of three at least, unless one of the two teams banned it, it could just get picked, even if neither team in a veto would ever have actually picked it as the last map. So the problem was this, right? All you need to know is this. Nip played the map in the group stage and got shit on by Shox's Epsilon team, who, by the way, the reason I say Shox's is most of you, I might know them, but most people couldn't even name the 5 players on that team, and they lost on this, right? But then in the playoffs, the randomizer picked it for them 2 times as the third map, and they won it 16-14. Then Fnatic actually tried to sort of mind game them by picking it at the final. They won that one as well, NIP. So essentially, in a series, NIP won this major, barely creeping over the line in 3-map series 3 times in a row, and in all 3 series they had to win Cobblestone all of the times. But the fact that they were shit on it the first time shows you that, like, that means even they were just sort of like locking into it, like, fuck it, roll the die, fuck, we won again, Snake Eye, like, you know, like, who the fuck, well, sevens, I guess in this case, or whatever, but, you know, like, even they didn't even really know what was going on. So I think that for CSGO, typically a game where you can sort of identify the factors, that might be the most, like, egregious example of essentially, like, the game dev, like the hand of God just leaning down and going, right, Nip, I'm just going to lift you up and give you this title, mate. Like, they still had to win the game, but even so, mate, I've never seen a more ridiculous, like, dev push that obviously wasn't targeted, but inadvertently just made one team win. Like, I look at that tournament, mate, and I'm not joking. There are like 2 or 3 other teams, like Fnatic in the final, LDLC in the semi-final, maybe even Cloud9 in the quarterfinals. If I'm any of these teams, I'd feel like hard done by. Like, mate, that could have been my major. All 3 of us could have won this major, maybe.
Yeah, so that's one example I think that everybody who is aware of it will sort of look to when I talk about developer overreach. But the other thing is that in League of Legends for a long time, it was years in a row, seasons after seasons, where Worlds would be preceded by some insane, powerful patch that maybe, if you were lucky, I think the LPL playoffs would be played on. And so you'd get a little bit of a sneak peek of what the meta might look like just based on the scheduling there. But even sometimes I think there were some that was before any games have been played. The first time any team that's qualified for the World Championship of that year is playing on the patch is in a World Championship game, you know, in the group stage. And this is something that I always never was able to figure out the motivation behind. You know, a cynical marketing angle might be that, oh, well, our players will draw more eyeballs because they're playing something brand new that nobody knows what to expect. But, you know, at that point you are sabotaging the competitive integrity in my mind. So is this a situation where you think, like, it feels like you've told this story before, where basically the saying goes, Riot will eventually come around to a reasonable approach, but it'll be years after the line. Careers will have been affected, you know, broadcasts will have been affected, and they also make out like they came up with the idea themselves, even though for years and years people were yelling at them, no, do this. So could you say a few words on how the Riot balance is shaping up so far, and whether or not you think it's gone in a wholeheartedly better direction after they stopped patching right before Worlds? Because I think maybe there was even some story where this might have happened before an MSI or one of these other sort of mid-season tournaments. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Oh, as far as I know, loads of times they've had like patches that were never played on before Worlds, for example, or like, even though it's like like an update, it's like actually it had something that ends up radically just changing the whole draft, the entire fucking game, maybe becomes like the OP shit or whatever. The main problem, as far as I can tell, is this, is even though Riot try to sort of cover it or play interference for the idea that it's affecting the competitive integrity by saying, like, you know, a skill of being a team is adapting, and, you know, which, by the way, obviously on some level is true. It's just the question is, like, I can't adapt from being a wide receiver to being a fucking, like, offensive linebacker, can I? Like, it's not even the same fucking style of play. Like, in that scenario, I'm not adapting. It's one thing if you say adapt to, like, running a different route. Yeah, I can adapt within what's reality. But the problem they have is they sort of, like, it beggars belief what they think adaptation is. Because as I say, as I allude to, their version of adaptation is, oh, was your, like, top laner a weak side top laner, and that's why you were the best? Well, spoiler, carries only top now, bitch. Like, well, I can't adapt to that scenario. I just will lose the game. That's it. Like, nothing I can do will change it. Unless, by the way, I had some sort of insane ability to change players, which obviously is not in their game, by the way, probably one of the least open to being able to change players at any random time. You're sort of locked in for a year with a team usually. So I would say the main problem is, Like, I've just seen almost not every worlds, but many worlds, in my opinion, were decided by the patch more than they were decided by the best team. And the best example ever has got to be the best region right now. So the best region overall is the LPL. It's the Chinese region, because they obviously have so many people who play it, and the actual like infrastructure of League of Legends esports is so developed there that they just have like more top teams than any other region. Like, even if LCK sometimes might have the number one team, if they have the number one team, often, like, 4 or 5 of the top 6 or 7 will still be the LPL teams. That's how strong this region is. Well, all that needs to be said is this: despite the fact the LPL has won 3 of the last 4 world championships, I would, and trying to obviously be as fair as I can as a historian and someone giving context, if you asked me the main reason those teams won, I wouldn't start with like the star players or what they did in split. I would actually say, unfortunately, the patches that they were on and the meta that they came into at those worlds. Because in my opinion, the 3 LPL teams that won worlds, it wasn't that like they were the team that adapted to what happened in the back. It's that essentially the LPL is just like generating an infinite number of teams, and then it's like, because you've also got so much talent, they all have really good players. If one of them suits the meta, they're the most likely one to win. And I'm sorry, that really is kind of what happened. Like, if people don't know, in season 8, the best team in the world was an LPL team, but it was RNG from China, and it was actually their rival IG, who'd never been able to get over the hump and win the LPL, who won worlds because the meta just switched to the solo lanes, which were the strength of IG. Then the next year, you had the FPX team win with a very unusual style of play. They were basically the only ones who sort of identified how to make this work, but it made them beat the best team in the world. Then this year, you had EDG win. By the way, nobody picked them to win worlds. Literally not a single person I'm aware of, even though they were the LPL champion, picked them to win worlds. But they won, as far as I can tell. Again, you look at the meta, they were an example of a team where it's not that the meta hit them in the face, it's more like they actually just had like a very, like, it's a bit like heroic in CSGO. They had a very even skill distribution. So it meant they actually were a rare team that maybe could adapt because they had like good enough players at the positions. So in this scenario, that already kind of sucks. You'll notice by how I'm saying that. Like, realistically, what I want to do when I tell that story as the historian is, if I say IG won worlds, I want to now start with like a 10-minute like wax and lyrical about the Shy and Rookie and all that. But I have to point out that, like, mate, they were still the Shy and the Rookie before the patch, and they couldn't fucking win. So unfortunately, I do think in League especially, obviously Worlds is the ultimate barometer of this. I think there's a reason why you have so many surprise winners, and why it's not just like the number one team in the world wins, and by being the number one team in the world, there's too many factors at play that when I look at a game, the obvious contrast is a game like CSGO where not much changes. It's night and day as games for me. Like, I can predict a lot easier in CSGO if someone's going to win than I can in League,
I wanted to switch games a bit to talk about Valorant, actually, because this is a game where I've been following from a distance, not checking up on it too much. Obviously, another Riot intellectual property. I am very cynical when it comes to anything that one of these bigger developers do, be it Riot or Blizzard. I look at Overwatch as an example of a forced esport where they were essentially just trying to dump in as much money as they could, secure the right people for partners, secure the funding, and they started out with, maybe you could say, a lesson from League by instantly going into franchising when they started taking over the space, because I think there was at least 1 year where they were allowing independent tournament organizers to run things, but that was fairly early on in the scenes space. So if we look to that as an example, I feel like Valorant is more towards Overwatch than it is towards CSGO as far as the cycle goes. It's certainly very similar in theory. A lot of people are saying it will eventually become similar, or they're predicting that it will become similar to League, where there's going to be seasons or splits, or, it's going to be much more internal to how Riot controls things. And you've already, I think, seen them start to really throw their weight around a little bit and say, oh, you're complaining on Twitter, we're not hiring you for an event, or something to that effect. Like, we've seen them start to pull people's cards depending on what they like or don't like. So do you agree with the premise that Valorant is a forced esport, and do you think that's even going to have a merit on its success? Because obviously one of the big things that I always look for is, how is the grassroots organization? How many people try the game and then like the game and then spread it word of mouth? And, obviously on Reddit, it looks like a lot of stuff is astroturfed, but how much of that seems genuine? I haven't seen a lot of like genuine and also long-term support for Valorant in the people that I talk to. So I wanted to get your view on it, having seen so many games come and go at this point. You think Valorant's here to stay?
The trouble is, the Blizzard games are probably the best example. So if you look at like WCS and you look at what happened in Heroes of the Storm, essentially when you say it, it's artificial or it's a forced esport, that sounds like it's just some temporary thing where, like the rich daddy's giving you like some extra pocket money and you can just, no, like if they want to, they can run that shit for 10 years. Like they can, essentially, as Overwatch shows, listen, it could be like, this is the reason why. It's funny with Richard. I had a similar scenario as I had with my mate Lurpis, Tommy. with Tesla. So if people don't know, a famous detail of Tommy, formerly Lurpis, is that he obviously not only was literally shorting Tesla stock at one point in time, but he believes Elon Musk is a con man and that Tesla as a company essentially will fail in the long run. Now, here's what's funny, is if you ever actually go and look into any of the stuff he's retweeting or that he's talking about, he's right. Like, actually, he's nailed it. Like, there's a million lies that Elon Musk's given. There's loads of, like, totally unrealistic, like, fucking benchmarks of where they're going to be or things the companies. There's loads of, like, borderline legal things he's done that he's sort of skirted around because he probably has an army of lawyers and more money than God and he can pay any little slap on the wrist. There's loads of shady stuff. Then the company itself, like, they don't basically deliver in the way they say they do. They haven't made as many cars as they say they do. It has way more problems than they say it does. There's features, like, you know, they try and almost claim it can drive itself, that, like, if I'd got people killed. But if you ever look into it, right, he's totally right for almost full spectrum. But here's where he fucked up. He thought that this was just like if I made a company and he knew that I was corrupt and I've done it. And he thought, right, well, what'll happen is they'll get shut down. People will realize it's a scam. People won't buy it anymore when they find out this information. It's all fucked up. And you know what? Eventually, the stock's just going to tank. And he would have been the smart guy, right? The mistake he made, though, is you have to ask, like, yeah, but who are the people propping up and helping Tesla to succeed? And when you find out that, like, in the case of Tesla, it's the fucking US government. It's like taxpayer money. It's like breaks and competitive advantages and loopholes in regulations that other people who are like your direct competitors don't get, for example. So when you know that, that's essentially like saying, it's like Lurpis telling me, oh, this guy's going to lose at Monopoly. He's really bad at the game. And me being like, but his brother's the fucking bank. And his brother said he thinks his brother's going to have a good game this time. Winked at me like, what, you know, like at that point, mate, the fix is in. You can't beat that. Like, they've got, so in the same way, right, the problem is that's what a forced esport is like. So I agreed with Richard from day one. It was obvious Overwatch could not succeed because in that game, it's the easiest of all. You don't even have to say what's wrong with it. You just have to go. You're essentially trying to cut the Gordian knot here, mate. It's important. How do you make an enormous casual game that's also like a franchise game that also only takes place in LA, but also is the entire world play? Like, these things can't all be at once. They're like, for them mutually exclusive, you fuck. So I remember thinking, he's going to be totally right. He's going to nail every aspect. But as you see, if they really do just say, put another billion in, it just keeps going and it won't stop. So you actually are right. Like, functionally, it is failing. But essentially, the question is, how far are they willing to go? So unfortunately, I get the similar vibe about Valorant. Because here's the thing about Valorant that doesn't make sense. It can't be that people are following it as an esport just because they like the game. Because since it's a brand new game, it even came out, if you remember, as a beta, when actually we went online in CSGO and everyone was sort of a bit disillusioned with CSGO because we weren't having any lands. I remember there's loads of top pros even gave it a try then. Right? Logically, if it just is a really good game and a really good esports game, like a competitive title, why didn't loads of top pros just switch? No one did. What happened was really bad people switched who had a history in CS. Some people switched who were like, this is like the Soms and the fucking Wardells. They were like, they might have made it one day or soon, but they hadn't quite made it. And so they thought, fuck it, I'll sort of go where like it's less established. Those make sense. Yeah, they also people logically would leave. Then you had the ones where because there became a weird thing where it was getting more money and attention, there's people who are like borderline who sort of chose Nitros of the world who were like, maybe now I do go over to that. Maybe I pivot essentially. For them, they're thinking it's almost like a side grade, but maybe with more money or less pressure. But then what you didn't get, you just didn't get, despite the fact it's a game like CS, you didn't get a large swathe of the people who played it casually or professionally just go to the game. So my problem there is that's what would make the impetus for a scene. The fact that loads of people play it, therefore loads of people watch it, and then, you know, like you've seen organically how scenes build out. You know, you get more and more viewers. This tournament starts this one, it could consolidate into a league. The game dev drops a little tournament. Someone else, DreamHack drops a tournament. Fucking MLG drops it. Like, you know, over time it builds up. Instead, this is more like, right, I've just decided this is going to be an esport. So here's some tournaments. And then the weirdest part of all about Valorant, I know, that it's only comparable to like the weird games like Fortnite and Minecraft, believe it or not, is that supposedly, I know Monty always tells this anecdote because he's been in a lot of these discussions where newer people are coming in the scene, VC people, like people from sports. What happens is there just becomes almost a sort of like flavor of the month for games. And there almost is like a cargo cult vibe of like, well, we have to have that game because I've heard, like, that's why Fortnite was one of them, because it isn't a joke. There really were all these old, like, real baby boomers who were in offices. And then what happened is they had, like, you know, a fucking, like, great nephew or fucking something who plays Fortnite or Minecraft. And then they would just say, oh, I've heard about esports. Well, do you have a Fortnite team? And what would happen was, instead of just saying, like, well, no, I'm Cloud9 and Fortnite's sort of like a little kid's game, as you say. Like, I'm doing a sport. They would just go like, oh, yeah, we've got we're getting a Valorant team and, Fortnite, yep, of course. we're a top org, and they essentially played this silly game for the VC where it was sort of like, better just do whatever he says. And so there is a vibe where Valorant has benefited from that as far as I can tell. Now, that's the reason, for example, why there are some really big American orgs who have a Valorant team. Some of them even have two. Some of them have all those game changer ones with like women for woke reasons, obviously, and a real Valorant team. And then they don't have a CSGO team, which is like, what? But that's the reason why, because they don't feel like there's an extra impetus in terms of their business strategy. So I think at the moment they're playing with almost like a stacked deck. Like essentially everything in the industry wants Valorant to be CSGO. In fact, I think some people, for obvious reasons, would rather it was instead of CSGO, if you look at some of the people out there. But the problem is, thus far, it doesn't seem like on its own steam it's getting to that point. And it does seem to me like I think almost certainly for it ever to really become like a true title like League of Legends, the ones that are considered like the biggest in the world, I think essentially Riot will have to like just put a massive amount of money down. And it'll be like halfway between what Overwatch is and something else like that. I don't know that it'll ever be as big though, personally.
I'm kind of of a similar mind as far as like the comparisons to what Valorant could be and then League of Legends, what it is now, what it might be in the future. I wanted to dig a bit deeper on League again, specifically, but this time from the angle of the size of the scene. Because, I mean, I come from Brood War. I'm looking for these like more mechanically demanding games. And I remember you probably gave this anecdote a long time ago, but I remember there was one where you mentioned that basically you went from like if you could look at RTS to MOBA, it's like you took away more than half of the game and now you're like, oh yeah, here you go. Or the other example might have been, you're only moving with the mouse and you're doing all of your actions primarily with the mouse. Obviously the keyboard for hotkeys and shortcuts, but like that's still like you're not even moving with one hand and shooting with the other like in an FPS or anything. Like there's not really much game here almost if you're used to those older games. That's where I'm coming from. And so for me, I mean, I understand the whole idea that you dumb it down or you water the concept down or you make it approachable for the average person. But it's really hard for me to wrap my head around why it is so big and successful, because I feel like there must be, maybe an untapped market in this sense for a player base who wants something that is current, but also much more demanding of the player to improve, to play to a high level in order to find success than what League currently offers. Could you say some words about why you think that League itself has gotten to the size that it's gotten? And do you predict, based on any trends you've seen so far, that it will continue to grow or at least stabilize? Or do you think it's headed for a downward spiral? What do you think?
I mean, if you just look cynically at who Riot Games are and what League of Legends was when it came along as a game, the joke is, I don't know whether they intentionally did this. Like, I actually think it almost could be like they think they're trying to make the best game, but they just incompetently made a not very good game because they're not very impressive people themselves, Like, spoiler, there are no Hideo Kojimas at the top of Riot Games. Like, none of those people are brilliant. None of them would ever need to be listened to. And I've no doubt the second any of them stopped pressing a keyboard, it probably got better. I don't think they were ever the geniuses bringing. They're not like John Carmack's or that company or whatever.
Yeah, so hundreds of years of experience in game design across the whole company.
So my problem is, to me, it looks like you get a bunch of people with mediocre minds who take the game DotA, which I was, compared to the games like CS and Quake, I was never that big a fan of anyway. But okay, within its genre, it was a very hardcore game at the time. In fact, that's what it was mainly played as. And basically, they took this, and it's like they made Babby's first MOBA. They made strip it down, sort of take like the sort of like the short-term simple fun aspect, but take out those really complicated things where you can like creep deny and get all that shit out, make that easier, streamline it, make it very simple, make it more appealing to kids, very flashy, simple cartoony graphics, and then voila, you ended up with a game where it is the ultimate lowest common denominator like esport game, isn't it? I mean, I'll at least give it credit, at least it does have an actual pro game that can like sort of be viewed unlike the Fortnites and the Minecrafts of the world. It doesn't have that problem, but I do think the issue is it basically is just like, it's like you took everything challenging out of DotA. So there's still something there. I mean, there's still something to enjoy, or at least especially if you're very new to games and you haven't played many games. There's something that can be fun about it. In fact, I'd even say, unfortunately, a selling point I do think for newer people is that it is easier. It's not as complicated. I mean, they sort of do offset that themselves by making all these new champions with like a million abilities and stuff we don't know what you're doing. But even so, the basics of League themselves are fairly welcoming to the beginner. Even the game itself, bizarrely, the sort of meta is a little bit easier to figure out than if you play CS or you've never watched a pro game. You wouldn't really know what you were doing and what spot to even go to. But you can sort of infer it in League. So the problem is, I do think a lot of it's like that. Because if you look at the other games that were within the genre, including the ones that never made it, like the fucking like Heroes of New Earth's the obvious example to me. Heroes of New Earth to me really does look like someone was a hardcore DotA fan, and they said, I want to make an updated version of this in a better engine, and maybe even, you know, add in some more hard things or mechanical tweaks. And, you know, I'm basically a DotA fan. Whereas League's almost like someone came along, funny enough, this is like Hollywood style. It's like someone came along and saw a brilliant independent movie and was like, let's do a remake of that, but put fucking, I don't know, Kiefer Sutherland in it and then Adam Sandler. It's almost like that, you know, like in some like cynical focus group, like these are the exact two people to put in the movie. That's what like the Riot's side feels like. So to me, the fact it became a huge esport was a big shock to me, because back then, believe it or not, we didn't go on like the game with the most total players becomes the biggest esport. It used to have to be a good game. But the idea it could have the most casual players, that actually does make sense to me after I've seen the game and its development.
And it's one of those things too where I've heard, I think Monte Cristo is the one to say this before, is that maybe this was actually in relation to Overwatch now that I'm thinking about it, but something to the effect of, you know, the game with the most casual players, like League, for example, it doesn't really have a good conversion rate. It's just that because of the raw floor, the raw numbers, you can have a low percentage, but still have a high like absolute in comparison to everything else for esports viewers. And that's one of those things that always struck me as like, you know, they're actually doing maybe a poor job of trying to carry over the casual person to get excited about the competition. I wanted to also circle back to a point you made earlier when we were discussing weapon balance and metas and some of the stuff that you liked. You mentioned that you don't really care about whether or not the pros or the developers are professional player caliber in that sense. Obviously, they have different responsibilities anyway, but you do want them to be grounded, I think is how you described it, right? You want them to be understand what the meta actually is, or what at least high skill gameplay looks like. Do you think that there's been a recent example of a developer who seems to actually comprehend what the game is and, you know, how to find success in it? Because it looks like when I look at patch notes, when I look at the just general trends of like looking at, you know, the competition within games, it doesn't really feel like a lot of developers, they're making changes that if I reverse engineer where they're going, it looks like they have a misconception of how the game is played well. What do you think about that?
I mean, to me, the obvious one's DotA, because they have Ice Frog in his team.
Fair
but
enough.
Here's the thing. I think here's the distinction. And this is actually where you could obviously infer a greater point here about society and non-esports here, but I'll leave other people to make that conclusion themselves. Basically, the problem goes like this. I don't actually want Valve to listen to us, because first of all, who the fuck's us? Like, would I want them to listen to that idiot Loba streamer, or would I want them to listen to some bonehead Zeus from CSGO? No, I would want them to listen to someone smart, right? So actually, bearing in mind, developing the game, I wouldn't even necessarily count myself as somebody who's smart. I'm not a game dev. I've never coded a line of fucking game code. I've never worked in one of those 3D modeling engines. I can only sort of tell you like directions or like things I like and don't like. I can tell you simple things. What I actually want is what they do in DotA, which is you have a real visionary. Ice Frog's basically like a fucking movie auteur who has complete control, and he comes in and he thinks what he would want DotA to be. He thinks, right, well, I'd like to reinvent this aspect of DotA. You know what, this has gotten a bit stale. What if we change this? And then the idea is he presents it to you, but just like an artist, if you think an artist's really good, I always say it's like mentally you just give them sort of like the blank check. It's like, no, I'm in for this, you know, like I'll give you an example. If someone's a fan of a band like Tool or something, odds are they're going to listen to the next Tool album no matter what it's like. Even if they did some totally different style of music, the idea is you're that invested and you've enjoyed enough of the music that you're going to go, you know what, I'll go along for the ride, whatever it is. But in my opinion, that's the game dev you want. It's a leader. Someone comes in, they're a thought leader. They come in and they go, this is how I'm going to change it. And we're going to do something new with the game. And then the idea is, we might not initially like it immediately, but we've got to play the game. We've got to figure out how it's played. We've got to learn. We've got to see what they were going for. And if you do it right, that's why, in my opinion, DotA's the right approach. Because, look, there are definitely a million whining cunts in DotA from the fan base, but I also get the vibe that they've actually finally learned the pattern. That, like, even if in the short term they don't necessarily like something that was done, sometimes it does end up being better, or it makes the game fresh, or it reinvents something. Like, I'll give you an example in CSGO of something that never would ever have been changed if they asked pros, but Valve was right and we were all wrong. I was wrong, by the way, totally on this one. And it's definitely those fucking game sound updates they made. When they made that, if you don't know, every pro in the scene, was like, this is, like, half of them are shit, because if you remember famously, like, the pistols were the worst ones. Like, the P250 sounded like someone flicking an elastic band. Whereas if you remember, every gun was like a really high, like, Like, it sounded brutal when you fired guns. So the problem is, because it didn't feel as good when we first made those sounds, we all complained about everything, the silencer, and the joke is, if you go back now and watch a game from 2013, it just sounds like they're trying to assault your ears in Guantanamo Bay or something. It's mental. Like, it's a nightmare when people are firing like 3 AKs and a deagle next to you. Like, the joke is, it's just that we were uncomfortable with actually the change in that scenario. But once it came through now, like I said, no one would go back. That was a mega change that no one asked for. No one would even have signed off on if they'd have sort of given us a PBE like we could test it on. But it actually ended up they were right and we were wrong. Like, they should actually have taken it in that direction. So I hope something like that. That's what I want for my game dev. I want people who, it's like, the idea is they lead and they have their own vision. And you give them a chance to properly execute a coherent vision. And then after the fact, we can all judge if it's good or bad. Some of them are going to be great. Some of them are going to be terrible, depending on what game dev.
And that goes back to another point you made earlier about how a lot of the times you gave StarCraft 2 as an example. Their patch would come out, something would be discovered that's overpowered, then the patch would come in 6 months later or something to that effect. And by that point, it's already been addressed by another effect of the meta, second or third order responses to that exact thing. Do you feel like most games that do receive these regular updates don't actually provide enough time to sort of have breathing room to see if the development was in the right direction or if it just needs to be tweaked or if it needs to go a completely different area, gets utterly replaced? Because I feel like even in Counter-Strike, which is bizarre because the updates tend to be less frequent, I still do sometimes see like either like in the case of the economy, you said earlier, it's kind of camouflaged by the A1S change. It feels like that's been here for years now, and we still haven't found a way to fix it. Or Valve have decided to just ignore it or leave it as is for the most part. And so there's an example of the opposite, where it's like, okay, this should have changed a long time ago, but hasn't. But then there's a lot of other times where I think in the Krieg and Augs case, you can make an argument for doing less of a change, just a slight, dial it back, raise the price of the guns or something to that effect, or have them both be powerful in the same time frame. So, they wasn't going whiplashing from one side's gun is powerful to the other side's gun is powerful. So I feel like either developers pull the trigger too fast on their changes, or they paradoxically don't ever readdress some things. Do you have any thoughts on maybe more positive examples of this trend?
The problem I have is I've never actually known, this is why I said I don't think for the opener if they did for that, I've never known what real metrics are they actually going off. Because if you notice, the really alarming thing in CSGO and League of Legends is whenever they sort of cite information that would like back up why they're doing something, it tends to be the alarming stats. Like they'll cite like the win rate of a champion just in all of solo queue. It's like, holy shit, what are you talking about? So essentially what you're telling me is that suddenly Zoe's overpowered because people in gold can play her. You know what I mean? Like, to me, that's like a non sequitur. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, but I get the vibe that these are the sorts of like the markers that they're looking for, if they're an uptick, if they're downtake, like the worrying trends, like these are where they're getting these things as far as I can tell. So I certainly wonder in that scenario, that's why I say I want them to be grounded in the scene, as in just stuff like, for example, if the Valve devs, let's say they had 8 people who work on CSGO, I would hope like at least a couple watched IEM kind of hates it. Is that too much to ask? One of the, like one of the top 3 or 4 events of the whole year. I'm not saying give it your whole life and be a fan every night watching all, but I hope at least you're watching those games so that at a minimum you're thinking things I think. Like, I'll give you an example. I was thinking the other day, like, let me think, what would I pick as the example for this? But I was actually trying to think who it was I was going to pick for this. I can't remember which team. There was a team at Katowice. Basically, I was thinking, like, I actually think one of the reasons they might not be as strong now is that, like, the CT side is better, basically. And, like, their T side, I can't remember which team it was, but that was one of those things you start thinking about. So then you start thinking both ways, like, well, is it the team that's changed? Like, did they not get as good? Is it the game that changed? So fundamentally, they're playing a different game. I'd at least want you to be having those thoughts as you're watching the game. Similarly, by the way, when you watch, like, a simple play, yeah, you should probably think, like, whoa, should the gun really be able to do that? But then the premise would be, you'd keep watching, and then you'd see a game where, like, I don't know, fucking the worst AWPer tried something like, well, I won't say Lucky's not the worst AWPer, but like something nowhere near simple level. You'd see them and you'd go, oh wait, no, actually this is a pretty balanced gun. Like, if this guy's a pro as well, then it has to be, it's a range and it's a limited. So the problem is, I have a hard time finding good examples of them changing in that sense. Like most game devs, most of them, as far as I can tell, did just based on casual play. So probably the most egregious example ever, in my opinion, of a non-change is actually StarCraft 2 with the whole like Broodlord Infestor period. Because if people don't know, we were competitively, if you followed like Korean League, StarCraft, for example, when we were already like way beyond the point where it looked like a joke, like beyond a parody, how broken it was for the Zergs, that was still the time where the main devs of Blizzard were sort of like, data isn't in yet, jury's out as to whether this is actually like overpowered. I know people anecdotally are saying it might be, but that's not what the data we're getting. And so everyone in the pro scene for real was just sat around like, what are they watching? Like, are they not watching these games? Like, what are they basing it off? And so I think that was like an example where, to me, it's like they weren't even, it wasn't even, they were in the same world almost, it felt like.
Right. So I wanted to ask a little bit about interfacing with the pro scene on a competitive level. I feel like you've made this point before that League of Legends, even though it has the most audience, perhaps, it's not really the best game for actually looking and understanding what's happening. Obviously, Counter-Strike is an example of a game where, as far as, you can make comparisons or complaints about you throwing the utility and how you have to be in certain lineups, and maybe you don't know how that works intuitively. But you also know, oh, that guy put his crosshair on the other guy's head, and now that guy doesn't have his head anymore. Like, that's a very intuitive aspect. The guns are grounded in reality, which is something that is actually in contrast to Valorant, where they're a little bit more thematic or a little bit more, flavorful, you could say. Whereas even if the guns aren't really the same models are going to be present in it, stuff like the AK, the Deagle, everybody kind of knows what that is. So it's much more, I would say, like, there's a lot more intuition present immediately just based on that. And then if you look at the other end of the spectrum, I guess you could say Counter-Strike is on the left side. It's the most easily intuitive, right? Counter-Strike and FPSs in general, probably. And then there's MOBAs in general, League of Legends, Dota 2, where it's kind of hard to understand what effects do. A lot of the times, maybe this is a problem that Riot could address by looking at their art and trying to do another pass on it to make sure that they understand that, simple things like the Jinx rocket gets more damage over time, but it doesn't ever change visually. So the explosion happens, it's the same size as if it was point blank, right? These sort of things where intuitively you don't really know how much damage something is supposed to do or what the threat level is. And so it's hard for you to understand as a viewer. And then I think probably the most difficult one to toughest nut to crack is the RTS, because you have units where maybe they behave in a certain way. Like the obvious example would be like the Dragoon in StarCraft Brood War, where it has so many pathing issues, we could say, just to put it broadly, where, you can't believe how many clicks it took him to just get up a ramp with a couple of them, but that's actually impressive. And, that's something you're never going to be able to intuit just looking at it, not to mention all of the other things. So would you say that there's like a nice line to sort of ride in between here, where like there are steps or examples of things that were always intuitive about certain aspects of these games? Like, could you point out maybe an ability or a champion where you could always understand what was going on? You could always follow it in League. And maybe conversely, like, is there a long-standing issue in some of these games where it's like you've never understood why it hasn't been changed in that respect, for the sake of like maybe a simple change would massively improve how viewers get into the game? Or is this maybe more of an unsolvable problem, do you think?
The problem, I think, is I don't think almost any game dev's actually really thinking of this topic. I don't know if it ever is really something they truly address. Like, for example, if I had to guess what people think about when they're designing a League champion, I think it's things like the aesthetic of what it looks like when the ability's done. Does it look cool? Does it thematically fit with the lore of the things I don't give a fuck about, but I get why they care. It's the modern day gamers, like, thing they care about, Like, does this, like, make sense? Whereas, as you say, I would be going for things. You have to remember, I come from Quake, where in Quake, if people don't know, intentionally pro players would make the background texturing as simple as possible and the player model as bright as possible, so you had perfect visibility at all times. Like, the second you come on my screen, I'm going to notice you. Whereas, for example, especially when they made those new skins in CSGO like a year or so ago, famously, if you're like crouched in a certain part of it, I might not notice you when I first see it. That's so different. That's the difference between making something to be beautiful and to look amazing in a graphics engine and someone who's only going for functionality, basically. The problem is the game devs don't seem to really be on the functionality train, even though in my opinion it's core if you want the game to be really, really popular. Because as you're pointing out with League is the best example, there isn't really a rhyme or reason as to like how big the effect looks or what it does. Obviously you can see on the screen numbers of showing damage and stuff, but even so, there's a very poor correlation intuitively between what's happening and like how much damage it's done or how much it healed or how like key it was that this ultimate was used. Or it's like you have to essentially just be an expert about the game. It's a massive information burden. And then I'd even throw in as well, it's probably the silliest game in the regard that, like, in CS, everyone's at least like got a concept of what a lot of the roles do, so they can sort of vaguely, again, it's still mainly gunfights and flanks and team rotations, etc. But in League, I've always thought the silliest thing of all is people really do just play like, I just play like jungle, and then maybe I offer all like fucking top lane, and then the premise is like, how's that guy supposed to know how good this AD carry was when he did a team fight? You know, like, again, it's actually a bit weird in that regard. Like, whereas in CS, you still at least have a sense of what someone did in a clutch, or when they were the entry guy and you're the fucking lurker. I think it's a bit easier to understand. So I will say, I do think that they're way off on those. I'll even say though, by the way, this is where actually you can see how there's almost like an esports version of the Overton window, as it were, like where like culturally we just move position and we don't know that actually we stayed the same position, but now we're in a completely different end of the spectrum, as it were. So it would be this, which is now everyone always gives the game you said, Counter-Strike. That's the one that's the go-to, right? It's the most easy to understand. Well, the joke is back in the day it was Quake, wasn't it? Because Quake's 1v1 and it's very simple, and you know the difference between a rocket and a machine gun and a grenade. Like, the joke is Quake's an even more extreme version. So what's funny is, I remember when Counter-Strike was considered one of the more pleb mainstream games, believe it or not, it was actually good old sellout Carmack, who, even though he came up in esports talking shit on CS and saying how it was a game with no skill, when he was the product manager of ESL, spoiler, biggest game was Counter-Strike, he then had to become the #1 salesman for Counter-Strike. So the joke is, I remember him once saying, I think it was to a media guy, a line that was actually a very apt and shrewd line, which is, he said, even in a game like Counter-Strike, a lot of the skill is actually hidden because it doesn't appear on screen. So for example, if you think of a brilliant spray player like Elige from Team Liquid or Magisk from Vitality, if they do a really god tier spray, we only know that's god tier because we've sprayed those guns a million times. We know how fucking insane that control is. If you're actually a pure fan, you're just like, well, isn't he shooting where he's aiming? You know, like in Quake, if that's the lightning gun or whatever, it's going where it aims, doesn't it? If that's the plasma gun, it generally goes where it aims. Like, yeah, you have to lead it a little bit or whatever. But, you know, in general, it's like, it's more about how good is your sort of tracking aim? How good can you lock onto them? Whereas Counter-Strike, you know, we're talking about like someone's like literally, they're essentially using like a technique that they've algorithmically programmed in their brain to know how to, in the moment, react to a control mechanism of a gun that nothing on the screen tells you exists. Like, we don't even tell people, by the way, at any point in a broadcast that like these guns are accurate, you know. Like, they don't just, like, the bullets don't even go to the crosshair. So, and by the way, I've always thought, what the fuck does a casual fan do when they don't even have a crosshair on the AWP? Does he go like, what is this gun land? Is it a shotgun? Like, you know, like, essentially, even Counter-Strike, if you go to the most nitpick level, has aspects that actually aren't intuitive. Like, they actually, you have to know the game to know what they mean. It's just the difference is, you can pick that up. Whereas, like, as we're saying about League is like, it's like if you never even read any book and someone gave you a book in Chinese, you'd be like, I can't even get into this. Like, what is any of this? Like, what even is this? What are symbols? Like, you don't even know what a language exists. So to me, I think there's definitely levels to it. It's the reason why, though, I actually think esports has to, at some point, fundamentally change its approach. Because there's only, if you essentially keep going this current model, and the current model goes like this, everything's free, so the only way we can pay for it would by sponsors. And so if we want more sponsor money, we have to get more people watching. Well, spoiler, if you've looked at anything in mainstream culture, the more people have to be involved, the fucking shitter it's going to be. Spoiler, if they really were making the first Star Wars movie, knowing how many people would watch it now, they wouldn't make it as good, I'm telling you. It'd be worse. They'd already have had committees and focus groups and people fucking everything up and taking out. They're going to be like, well, no one's going to understand what the Force is, George. Like, take that out, call it like a superpower. You know what I mean? There'd be some arsehole marketing guy who would ruin everything. So in that sense, in my opinion, I'll tag this onto what I said earlier about the games that maybe like RTS games that are harder to understand, or games like Overwatch that just weren't as big. These games have to eventually go some sort of route where the actual person who watches pays for the game. Because if you do that, you can all of a sudden go back to a world where you could have 100,000 people watching instead of 1 million. You all of a sudden could have like a regional player that has like an actual future, instead of like the current approach is going to be every game's going to get more dumbed down because we're trying to get the entire fucking world to play and watch so that we can get like a tiny multiplier on the money we get for sponsorship. So if you think it's bad now, if any game you think now, like, this game's good, but I'm drawing the line now, no Fortnite. It's like, mate, the joke is in 10 years, Fortnite will be the hardcore game where they'll be like, but look at the building mechanics. Like, this is actual real skill. It's that new Roblox, like fucking Junior, that's the shit one. Like, that's where we're going to be, because the joke is, as everyone should know by now, when I came along in Quake, cocksuckers, literally like Carmack, were saying it's Counter-Strike is a noob game where you hide behind boxes and spray people in the back with MP5. Then the joke is the League fans who were like, Overwatch is shit, you can't even watch it. It's like, my head's on like a fucking, what? You're in League of Legends. What are you? So the whole, if this madness is only going to get worse, boys. It gets darker for me, in my opinion.
And I think your point about essentially trying to monetize perhaps more fairly or more, I don't know if aggressively is the right term, but just more completely a smaller scale of esports audience. I don't know about the monetization side of things, but at least the smaller scale thing I think is true for StarCraft 2 and maybe to a lesser extent Brood War, where people probably don't know much about these if they're not RTS enthusiasts, but there's still pro players, there's still pro games. Even at IEM Katowice, there was some StarCraft 2 being played. So that was just a week ago, right? So like these scenes still exist. It's just that you made a point that essentially they didn't, rocket up the same way League of Legends had explosive exponential growth, and to a lesser extent Counter-Strike, or maybe to a similar extent even, but not to the same degree of maximum ceiling. However, StarCraft 2 is still kicking. They still have players, they still have an ecosystem. It's just smaller. It's just more homegrown. Maybe you might get noticed if you pop into your favorite pro player's stream every now and then. They might actually be able to reply to you in that sense, because that's just the lay of the land there. I wanted to ask a little bit about, this can be sort of the final topic, we're winding down here. I wanted to ask if you had some sort of like final word or thoughts on how developers who want to support competition in their game, but again, not necessarily interested in forcing it, don't have the capital to force it the same way that, Riot and Blizzard have in the way that we discussed earlier. How would you go about doing that? Because my current conception of it is, the benevolent dictator approach sounds great until it's actually executed, because it only works when somebody like IceFrog, maybe an auteur who actually does have a vision, when they're actually competent, then it can work and then you can buy into it. But that's like the exception that almost proves the rule, that you generally don't want the developers to have a crazy amount of influence in there. Obviously, big devs, they time and time again will just pour money into it, like we discussed. Is the best approach do you think, to have the dev be hands off, or there's obviously the concern about whether or not they get into the game, and sort of like, Valve with Fallen recently, there was that conflict of interest where Valve is now being, in a sense, they're almost sponsoring. There's, that conflict of interest potential there for some hardware and some merch. And that's another thing that you have to worry about. So how do you handle these sort of violations of integrity, even if the developer isn't involved? If the developer is like Valve and they profess to enjoy this sort of clear competitive integrity ecosystem, but then don't actually do anything to enforce it when push comes to shove. I'm just wondering what a happy medium might look like, and maybe you've had some thoughts on this.
Like, the problem is, like I said, if it comes to actual like game balancing, in theory, I actually want the power to be in the hands of the game devs. I want them to go out and make the game they think they get how it should be. And I would hope, like, they're not just doing it willy nilly, like just a vibe that day. I hope they have like a design philosophy, and they've really thought it through, and what their principles of design are, and what type of game they're trying to make, and how they want to buy. I'd hope, we can get to the point where we're advanced in that sense. Beyond that, though, I don't think game devs should have almost anything to do with it. As in, even if let's say they actually on some level, but even believe it. I think this is a little bit naive to believe they actually think this is their, as opposed to like, it's mine. They might try and claim like, but I'm sort of like the caretaker of the game though. And if I'm not the one to do, then all these like scumbags will come in and do so. It's like, spoiler, like they will anyway. But okay, even if you want to go that route, in my opinion, it should more be that you like decide who you pick to then do things. Essentially, I want them to delegate. Because the problem is this: there's no game dev realistically that's better at running a stadium event than ESL if you give them the right amount of money in it and the model makes sense. There's no real game dev that's as good, in my opinion, as production as certain like OGN was, etc. Like, there's certain areas where people are just the best. They're the best in that area. So I would hope at a minimum you could work with these people. And in an ideal world, I'd like it if you could empower them. The main problem, as far as I can tell, is this though, is that most game devs have the vibe, like I said, of like a fucking little rich kid at his birthday party. He's like, it's mine, I don't have to share. So unfortunately, like, some of them really do think, they won't say it publicly, but if you talk behind the scenes, some of them will even just openly say this behind the scenes. Some of them don't want to give anyone else like any power, leverage, or agency over them. They don't want it to feel like that guy's essential to the game, and so now he could come to us and, like, make demands, or he could, like, he could influence the community to turn against us. Like, there's a million reasons that they don't sort of see an upside to doing that. The problem with that, in my opinion, is that level of paranoia, to me, probably suggests like you're a bit fucked up on some level. As in, like, it's like if your first go-to is like, well, every single person would just lie and screw me over. It's like, I wonder what you would do if you had to deal with it. That's something a little bit too close to home about that for me. So unfortunately, that's just the world most game devs are in. I don't think they really buy my vision. But essentially, like, this is another thing, by the way, that they did in DotA. People don't know it, but having that guy, Bruno, who used to be with the Good Studio and went to become like a guy who works at Valve, That's a massive deal because that now means people who know him in esports have an into the company. And because he came from esports, he might, for all I know, in Valve, he just does a normal Valve job or whatever, but he's bringing knowledge of the esports space, a grounding in the esports space. It doesn't have a natural bias against pro teams or players or something. It's not coming from the dev position initially. So that's essentially what I would like, is to some sort of like marry the scene a little bit more. Because instead it feels like the game devs, they either don't care about their game and suddenly an ESL has to do everything, which is too much, or they care. You can choose to what degree this is sinister or not. They care too much and they sort of like try to reinvent the wheel, which is the Riot approach, where you just like, you genuinely come along and go, right, kill all these golden gooks, and then go, why aren't we making any money in this game? Like, what do we do? How would one make money? It's like you think you're inventing like the wheel, there never was one. So I think there's too much of that goes on, in my opinion.
Last question here. You know better than a lot of people, I think, how valuable it can be to, if somebody exists and they have high standards, but they have a detached perspective. Like you mentioned earlier, you don't know, you don't have experience doing game programming or 3D modeling or anything like that. Any of the things that go into making a game like this. If you have this detached perspective and you don't have the same marriage to it in that respect, you can sometimes look at a tough problem and you can almost find an unexpected angle or a solution like that. Have you ever considered consulting with developers who are trying to put this together? Is that something you'd be interested in if somebody approached you and you prefer that they just build it before you come and you sort of figure it out as time goes on? What's your take on that?
I will say it is a lot easier. I don't just mean it like a glib way. It's a lot easier essentially to criticize than it is to create the idea, in the sense that by criticizing, you look at something that already exists and you can ask stuff like what doesn't work or what could you do differently. Whereas creating is like you have to come genesis the whole idea. Like that's way harder, obviously. So my problem is, I think the area I would be most suited to help these people is, if you notice, like in general in esports, what I tend to do is I try to like abstract out the general principle of a matter and then figure out where I stand on that. And that's what allows me, I hope, to be consistent on like competitive integrity or which players are good, which players I favor, what I think should change. So I think the area I could do the most good is just consulting on, like I say, like high resolution philosophy for design, essentially. Like what sort of a game, if it was an FPS game, what sort of a player are you trying to favor? What sort of style of interactions of players do you want? How would the structure, things like that, where it's like I'm essentially just coming up with like a large scale idea and then they would find what the application would be, or the literal like precision detail that would have to be implemented to make that work, or if it would work itself. I'd prefer like so almost like high level ideas like that. I think in that area I could maybe help out, just again from experience and all the years of observing the game and different angles. I wouldn't ever claim that I could do the minutiae. I think that's really difficult, actually. I even think that's one area I do actually have a lot of sympathy for game devs, which is I don't think fans know. Like League's probably the ultimate example. The sheer number of champions in League combined with other factors make it like an insane goal of light speed whack-a-mole, where the second that you whack the two here, it pops up over here. And it's like, realistically, you can't really whack them all at once. That doesn't exist. But we essentially do have an expectation that you can and you will, because we don't balance the game. You know, we just point out that we don't like stuff.
We at the No Frauds Club thank Thorin for his time. And if you want more thoughts, we hope to see you next time.